Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who says nothing at all. Daniel Whitmore didn't look up from his glass as the laughter spread behind the counter, low at first, then sharper, like it had found confidence in numbers, a quiet kind of cruelty that didn't need to be loud to be felt, and Emily Carter stood right in the middle of it, her hands steady as she folded a receipt, her posture straight, her face calm in a way that almost felt out of place in a room that thrived on noise. She didn't react, not when one of the servers leaned closer and whispered something just loud enough for the others to hear, not when another rolled her eyes and let out a soft, mocking chuckle. "She probably doesn't even understand half the things she writes down," someone said, and the group laughed again, quick, dismissive, already moving on like it didn't matter. But Daniel heard it, every word, every tone, every pause in between. He always did. That was how he built everything he owned, by listening when others assumed no one important was paying attention. He shifted slightly in his chair, the faint glint of his watch catching the light, a small, precise movement, almost invisible, but deliberate. He didn't interrupt, didn't glance over, didn't give them the satisfaction of knowing they had an audience. Instead, he let the moment stretch, let the silence settle where it wasn't supposed to, because silence, when used correctly, had weight. And Emily moved through it like she had learned that lesson long before anyone in that room. She picked up a tray, balanced it with effortless control, and walked past them without a word, her eyes focused ahead, not down, not defensive, just forward, as if none of it had touched her. And that was the part that caught Daniel's attention, not the comments, not the tone, but the absence of reaction. Most people filled silence with excuses or anger or something that tried to prove they belonged, but she didn't try to prove anything. She simply continued, and that was rare enough to make him pause. Rare enough to make him stay. A server brushed past her shoulder a little too carelessly, not enough to call it intentional, just enough to test boundaries. Emily adjusted her grip slightly, steady again, no complaint, no glance back, and somewhere near the entrance, a couple at a corner table exchanged a look, noticing, but choosing not to involve themselves, because that's how rooms like this worked. People saw, people understood, but they waited to see who would speak first. And Daniel knew they were waiting for someone like him, someone with authority, someone who could shift the entire atmosphere with a single sentence. But he didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even lift his eyes fully, because this wasn't the moment for interruption. It was the moment for observation, for understanding who people were when they believed no consequences existed. And as Emily placed a plate down at a nearby table, her voice soft, polite, measured, completely untouched by what had just happened, Daniel finally looked up, not at the group behind the counter, but at her, just for a second. Long enough to notice the precision in her movements, the way she calculated space without hesitation, the way she listened before anyone finished speaking, and then he looked back down again, as if nothing had changed, as if he hadn't just decided something without saying a word at all. The check landed softly on the table, perfectly aligned with the edge, as if even paper deserved order. And Emily stepped back without waiting for acknowledgement, her attention already shifting to the next movement, the next need, the next quiet calculation that kept everything running without anyone noticing who was actually holding it together. And Daniel watched that, not the surface, not the uniform, but the pattern beneath it, the way she anticipated before being asked, the way she adjusted when something was slightly off, like she was reading a language no one else in the room even realized existed. And across the dining room, the earlier laughter had not disappeared, it had simply changed shape, softer now, more contained, but still there, still circling, still testing, because people like that rarely stopped, they only adapted. One of the servers leaned against the counter, arms crossed, voice low but not low enough. "You ever notice how she writes everything down like it actually matters?" And another replied, "Maybe it is the most important thing she has going on." Followed by a small, careless laugh that drifted just far enough to reach the wrong ears, or perhaps the right ones, depending on how you looked at it, and Daniel did not move, not outwardly, but something in his posture shifted, almost imperceptible, like a decision forming without urgency, because urgency was for people who reacted, and he had built his life on choosing when not to. Emily returned to the service station, placing a pen down with exact placement, not tossed, not rushed, just placed, and for a brief second, her eyes lifted, not toward the voices, not toward the room, but toward the window where the late afternoon light cut through the glass in a narrow line, and then it was gone, replaced by that same composed focus, and Daniel noticed that too, the way she allowed herself exactly 1 second, no more, as if even reflection had a limit, a boundary she controlled, and then the moment shifted again. A man at table 12 raised his hand, impatient, his tone sharper than necessary when she approached. "This is not what I ordered," he said, though the plate in front of him matched the receipt exactly. Emily glanced at it, then at the paper in her hand, her voice even. "I understand, sir, let me check that for you." No defensiveness, no correction, just calm, and the man leaned back slightly, studying her as if expecting something else, an argument, an apology that went too far, anything that would confirm whatever assumption he had already made, but she gave him none of it, just precision, just control, and Daniel's gaze followed the exchange, not because it was dramatic, but because it was not, because the absence of escalation required more discipline than most people ever learned, and when Emily turned, adjusting the plate with a small, exact movement before stepping away, Daniel finally lifted his glass, not to drink, but to pause, to mark the moment in his own way, because something had just been confirmed, not by words, not by explanation, but by consistency, and consistency was harder to fake than confidence. And across the room, the voices had gone quieter now, not out of respect, but out of uncertainty, the kind that creeps in when something does not behave the way it is supposed to, when the person you dismiss does not react the way you expected, and Daniel let that uncertainty grow, let it settle into the corners of the room, because silence, when it lasted long enough, had a way of making people reveal more than they intended, and he was still not done listening. The restaurant began to fill with a different kind of energy as the evening crowd settled in, the kind that carried expectations, sharper tones, and the quiet pressure of appearances, and Daniel noticed the shift immediately, not because it was obvious, but because everything became slightly more calculated, every movement just a little more deliberate, every voice just a little more controlled. And Emily adjusted with it seamlessly, her pace unchanged, her expression steady, as if the rhythm of the room did not dictate her, but the other way around, and that was when it happened, subtle at first, almost invisible to anyone who was not paying attention, a folder placed on the counter near the register, thick, expensive paper, the kind used for contracts, not menus, left there by a man in a tailored suit who spoke too loudly and checked his watch too often, someone important enough to expect priority, but careless enough to assume no one else would understand what he had brought with him, and the other staff barely glanced at it, one of them even sliding it aside to make space without a second thought. But Emily's eyes paused for half a second longer than necessary, not obvious, not intrusive, just enough to register something, and then she continued, moving past it as if it held no interest at all, and Daniel saw that, the pause, the restraint, the decision not to engage. And his fingers tightened slightly around the edge of his glass, not out of tension, but recognition. Because that was not curiosity, that was awareness choosing patience, and moments later, the man returned, irritation already forming in his tone. "I need this process quickly," he said, tapping the folder with unnecessary force. "It is time sensitive." And Emily stepped forward, her voice even. "Of course, sir, I will make sure it gets the attention it needs." No promise of speed, no apology, just precision again, and the man nodded impatiently, already distracted, already assuming control of the situation. But as Emily opened the folder just enough to confirm the details, something shifted in her expression, not visible to most, but Daniel caught it, a fraction of a second where her eyes sharpened, where calculation replaced routine, and then it was gone, hidden beneath that same calm surface, and she closed the folder gently, not rushed, not careless, just deliberate, and placed it back exactly where it had been, aligned perfectly with the counter edge, as if nothing had changed. And that was when Daniel leaned back slightly, his gaze lowering again, but his attention sharper than before, because now there was a pattern forming, not just composure, not just discipline, but recognition, the kind that came from experience. From knowledge that did not belong in a place like this, and across the room. The earlier voices had quieted even more, not out of respect, but because something felt different now, something they could not name, the kind of shift that happens before a realization, before a mistake reveals itself. And Emily moved away from the counter, continuing her work as if the folder did not exist, as if the moment had passed, but Daniel knew better. Because people who truly understood something did not rush to prove it, they waited, they let the situation unfold until the truth had nowhere left to hide, and for the first time that evening, he did not just observe, he anticipated, not what she would do, but when she would choose to do it, and more importantly, why. The man in the tailored suit returned sooner than expected, his pace sharper now, his confidence edged with impatience, and the moment he reached the counter, his fingers tapped against the folder again, not out of habit, but out of pressure building beneath the surface. "Is it ready?" he asked, not looking at anyone in particular, just expecting the answer to come to him, and one of the servers glanced at Emily before stepping back slightly, as if instinctively deferring without understanding. "Why?" And Emily stepped forward, her hands calm, her posture unchanged. "It is being reviewed, sir," she said, her tone steady, and that single word lingered longer than it should have. Reviewed, not processed, not handled, but reviewed, and the man frowned, a small crack forming in his certainty. "Reviewed by who?" he asked, a little sharper now, and Emily met his gaze, not challenging, not submissive, just present. "By me," she replied, and for a brief second, the room shifted, not visibly. Not dramatically, but enough that Daniel felt it from across the space, like a subtle change in air pressure before a storm, and the man let out a short laugh, dismissive. Almost automatic. "You," he said, not cruel, but not respectful either, just certain of his assumption, and Emily did not react, did not defend, did not explain, she simply reached for the folder again, opening it with the same precise movement as before, and this time, she turned one page slightly, just enough for the numbers to catch the light, and Daniel leaned forward just a fraction, his attention narrowing. Because now the moment he had been waiting for was beginning to take shape, and Emily spoke again, her voice quiet, controlled. "There is a discrepancy in Section 3, she said, not accusing, not dramatic, just factual, and the man's expression shifted again, irritation mixing with something less certain. "That is not possible," he replied quickly, too quickly, and Emily nodded once, acknowledging the statement without accepting it. "It is small," she continued, "but it affects the total valuation by a significant margin." And she closed the folder again, gently, placing it back on the counter with the same exact alignment, as if the act itself carried meaning, and the man's jaw tightened slightly, his eyes flicking down to the folder then back to her, calculating, reassessing, and around them, the quiet had deepened, the earlier voices now completely still, replaced by a tension that no one had intended to create, and Daniel watched all of it without moving, because this was the reveal. Not the loud kind, not the kind that demanded attention, but the kind that shifted power without announcing it, and Emily took a small step back, giving space, not retreating, just allowing the moment to settle, and the man hesitated, just for a second, before reaching for the folder himself, opening it with less precision, flipping to the section she had indicated, and his eyes scanned the page, faster at first, then slower, and then he stopped, and that was when Daniel knew. Not from the numbers, not from the document, but from the silence that followed. The kind of silence that only appeared when someone realized something they had missed, something they should not have missed, and Emily did not speak again, did not fill the space, she simply waited, her hands still, her expression unchanged, as if she had already done what needed to be done, and the man closed the folder slowly this time, his earlier impatience gone, replaced by something quieter, something closer to respect, though he did not say it, not yet, and across the room, Daniel finally lifted his glass, taking a slow sip, his eyes never leaving the scene, because the pattern was complete now, the confirmation undeniable, and yet, he remained exactly where he was, silent, because the moment for him had not arrived, not yet. The silence that followed did not break immediately, it expanded, filling every corner of the room with a weight that felt heavier than sound, and the man in the tailored suit stood there for a moment longer than necessary, his hand still resting on the folder, as if letting go of it would confirm something he was not ready to accept, and Emily remained exactly where she was, not pressing, not retreating, simply present. Her expression unchanged, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. And that contrast alone was enough to shift the atmosphere again, because people expected reaction, they expected satisfaction or defense or triumph, but she gave none of it, and Daniel watched from across the room, his gaze steady, his mind already moving beyond the moment itself, because this was not about the folder anymore, it was about how quickly power could be redefined without anyone raising their voice. And the man finally exhaled, slow and controlled, adjusting his posture as if trying to recover something invisible. "I will need a full review," he said, his tone quieter now, less absolute, and Emily nodded once, acknowledging without agreeing. "Of course," she replied, simply, and that single word carried no emotion, no judgment, only certainty in process, and that was what made it land differently, because certainty without ego was harder to challenge, and the man glanced at her again, longer this time, studying rather than dismissing, before finally closing the folder and stepping back from the counter, and as he turned away, the earlier confidence in his stride had softened, not broken, but adjusted, recalibrated in a way only he understood, and the room slowly returned to its rhythm. But it was not the same rhythm as before, something had shifted beneath it, subtle but permanent, like a note slightly out of tune that everyone now had to unconsciously adapt to. And Emily resumed her work without pause, moving from counter to table with the same quiet precision, but Daniel noticed that the staff around her had changed. Too, not in behavior, but in awareness, glances lasting half a second longer, voices lowering just slightly when she passed, and that was when it became clear, not to them, but to him, that influence did not always announce itself, sometimes it restructured the space around it without permission, and Daniel set his glass down carefully, his fingers resting for a moment against the edge of the table as he considered what he had just witnessed, because what Emily had done was not confrontation. It was correction, not force, but clarity, and those were far more difficult to ignore, and across the room, she paused briefly at the service station, her eyes flicking once toward the window again, the same controlled moment as before, and then she continued, as if even that had been accounted for in advance, and Daniel finally understood that his silence earlier had not been passive, it had been strategic. Because sometimes the only way to see the full shape of a person was to let the world misunderstand them first, and Emily Carter had just been fully seen by the wrong people for all the right reasons. The restaurant had settled into a fragile calm, the kind that only existed after something important had already shifted, where people continued their routines but no longer trusted them in the same way, and Emily moved through that space with the same steady control, carrying orders, adjusting plates, responding with quiet precision, but now every interaction around her felt slightly recalibrated, as if unseen lines had been redrawn, and Daniel noticed it most in the way people paused before speaking to her, even if only for a fraction of a second, as if checking whether she was still the same person they thought she was, and across the room, a new guest had arrived, a man with a louder presence than his surroundings allowed, speaking quickly, confidently, as if the space itself should adjust to him, and he sat near the center of the dining area, immediately drawing attention from staff and guests alike. And when Emily approached his table, her movements remained unchanged, but Daniel observed her eyes for the first time sharpened slightly, not in reaction to volume, but to recognition, as if something about the request being placed carried more weight than usual. The man leaned back, speaking without lowering his voice. "I need this." "Expedited," he said, sliding a document across the table without ceremony, and Emily accepted it without hesitation, her fingers steady, her expression neutral, but this time, she did not immediately step away. Instead she paused, just long enough to scan the first page, and Daniel saw it clearly, a subtle tightening in her focus, not confusion, not surprise, but alignment. As if pieces were falling into place faster than expected, and the man continued speaking, unaware of the shift, listing expectations, deadlines, assumptions about authority, while Emily remained still, absorbing everything without interruption, and then she spoke, her voice calm but measured. "This cannot be processed under these terms," she said, and the sentence did not carry emotion, only certainty, and the man frowned immediately, leaning forward. "That is not your decision," he replied, faster now, more defensive, and for the first time that evening, Emily met resistance directly, not with force, not with escalation, but with clarity. "It is not compliant," she said simply, placing the document back on the table with exact alignment, and that single action changed the energy again, because it was not refusal, it was correction, and correction was harder to dismiss than disagreement. The man's expression shifted, irritation giving way to calculation, and he lowered his voice slightly, as if adjusting strategy. "Then who authorized this review?" he asked, and Emily answered without hesitation. "I did." And across the room, Daniel's gaze narrowed slightly, not at her confidence, but at the absence of doubt behind it, because people often borrowed authority, but rarely did they carry it so naturally without signaling it, and the surrounding tables had begun to quiet again, not fully aware of what was happening, but sensing the change in pressure, like air before a storm settles differently, and Emily finally stepped back, returning the document to its place, her posture unchanged, her attention already moving forward, as if this moment was only one part of a larger sequence already understood, and Daniel remained silent, but his focus had fully locked now, because what he was witnessing was no longer coincidence or observation, it was structure, and structure always revealed intent, and for the first time since he had entered the room, he was no longer simply listening. He was waiting for the moment when intent would finally become visible to everyone else. The atmosphere in the room no longer felt like a restaurant in motion, it felt like a system under observation, where every conversation carried slightly more awareness than before, and every movement seemed to pass through a filter of reconsideration, and Emily Carter continued her work as if none of it had changed. But Daniel Whitmore could see that something had already reached its threshold, because silence in a place like this never stayed neutral for long. It either dissolved or it became authority, and what he was witnessing now was the beginning of the second form. The man with the document had stopped speaking entirely, his earlier confidence replaced with controlled restraint as he studied Emily more carefully, as if recalibrating not just her role but his assumptions. And Emily stood near the counter again, the folder now returned to its original position, perfectly aligned as before. Untouched in appearance but no longer invisible in meaning, and another staff member approached her hesitantly, lowering their voice. For the first time that evening. "Should I escalate this to management?" they asked, uncertain not of the process, but of the outcome, and Emily paused only briefly before replying. "It is already handled." Her tone unchanged, not elevated, not defensive, simply complete, and that sentence carried a weight that extended beyond the counter, because it implied structure where others assumed randomness, and Daniel noticed the shift in how the staff reacted to her now, no longer dismissive, no longer casual, but cautious in a way that came from reassessment rather than instruction, and across the room, the earlier man finally closed the distance between himself and Emily's position again, but slower this time, as if approaching a boundary he was no longer certain he fully understood. "You said you reviewed this yourself?" he said carefully, and Emily nodded once. "Yes." And there was no elaboration, no justification, because none was required, and the man exhaled slowly, glancing down at the document again, then back at her, and for the first time, his tone softened slightly, not respectful yet, but no longer dismissive. "You are not listed in any authorization chain," he said, more as a statement than a challenge, and Emily responded without hesitation. "Then the chain is incomplete." And that single response changed the air again, because it reframed the assumption rather than defending against it, and Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not at the words themselves, but at the precision behind them, because that was not improvisation, it was understanding, and understanding rarely came from coincidence. And as the man stood there processing her response, a subtle shift occurred across the room, conversations lowering, movements slowing, attention naturally gravitating without announcement, and Daniel could feel it now more clearly than before. The moment where perception began to fracture into awareness, where people stopped asking whether something was unusual and began asking what they had missed, and Emily finally stepped away from the counter, moving toward another table with the same steady rhythm. But now every step she took seemed to carry a different meaning for those watching, not louder, not faster, just undeniable, and Daniel remained still, his expression unchanged, but internally everything had already aligned, because what he had been waiting for was no longer potential. It was confirmation, and the only thing left was the moment when everyone else would finally realize they had been watching the same person all along without ever seeing her correctly. The shift in the room was no longer subtle, it had become a visible current running beneath every table, every glance, every pause in conversation, and Emily Carter stood at the center of it without ever acknowledging its existence, moving with the same controlled rhythm as before, but now every person who passed her seemed to recalibrate their distance, as if instinctively recognizing that something about her could no longer be categorized as ordinary, and Daniel Whitmore watched it all unfold with quiet precision, because this was the exact threshold he had been waiting for, the moment where perception stopped being passive and began to fracture into realization, and across the room, the man with the document finally stepped back from the counter entirely, placing the folder down with slower, more deliberate care than before, as if even the object itself had changed meaning. And he looked at Emily for a long moment without speaking, not with arrogance anymore, but with calculation. And then with something closer to uncertainty, and that uncertainty spread quietly into the surrounding staff, one of them whispering under their breath, "She is not part of any executive team I have ever seen," while another responded, "Then who is she?" And the question hung there longer than it should have, unanswered and uncomfortable, and Emily continued working, approaching a nearby table where a couple had been waiting longer than expected, her voice calm as she confirmed their order. But even in that simple interaction, the tone of the room had changed, because now people listened differently, not because she demanded it, but because they no longer knew what they were missing, and Daniel observed how attention shifted in layers, first curiosity, then doubt, then reconsideration, and finally restraint, as if everyone had collectively agreed to be more careful without ever discussing why, and the man with the document finally spoke again, his voice lower now, directed at Emily but no longer carrying authority. "If you are correct about this discrepancy," he said slowly, "then the entire structure of the agreement needs to be reassessed." And Emily nodded once. "That is already in progress," she replied, and that single sentence caused a visible pause, because it implied action without permission, correction without escalation, and knowledge without explanation, and the man hesitated again, then asked, "Who authorized you to proceed?" And for the first time that evening, Emily did not respond immediately, not because she lacked an answer, but because she chose the timing of it, and when she finally spoke, her voice remained even. "Authorization is not required when the outcome is already known." And the words settled into the room like something heavier than conversation, and Daniel noticed the reaction immediately, not dramatic, but internal, the kind that happens when people realize their framework for understanding a situation is incomplete, and the man exhaled slowly, looking down at the folder again, then back at her, and this time he stepped back fully, not retreating, but yielding space, and around them the restaurant no longer felt divided between staff and guests, but between those who understood hierarchy as appearance, and those who were beginning to recognize something deeper. And Daniel remained exactly where he was, still, observant, because the final layer of this moment had not yet arrived, but it was close, and when it did, it would not require explanation, only recognition. The moment arrived without announcement, not as a sudden event but as a quiet convergence of everything that had been building since the first dismissed glance, since the first unanswered assumption, and the restaurant itself seemed to hold its breath as Daniel Whitmore finally stood from his seat, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the calm certainty of someone who had already seen the ending before it happened, and across the room, conversation stopped without instruction, not because they were told to stop, but because presence had replaced noise as the dominant force in the space, and Emily Carter, still near the service station, paused for the first time that evening without immediately moving forward, as if she had sensed the shift before it fully revealed itself, and Daniel walked slowly Not toward the center of attention, but toward the structure beneath it, stopping a few steps away from the man holding the document, who now looked less like someone in control and more like someone waiting for confirmation of something he no longer fully understood. And Daniel's voice, when it came, was not raised, not sharp, but precise in a way that carried farther than volume ever could. "You are correct," he said, and the man blinked, momentarily thrown off by the simplicity of agreement, and Daniel continued. "The discrepancy affects valuation, structure, and authorization. Validity across all projected outcomes." And a quiet ripple moved through the surrounding tables as people tried to understand what they were hearing, because recognition was beginning to replace assumption, and Emily remained still, watching without interrupting, and Daniel finally turned his gaze toward her directly, not as an observer anymore, but as someone acknowledging alignment. "This was not a correction initiated by the firm," he said calmly. "It was initiated by her." And for the first time, the room fully changed, not through sound, but through realization, because the identity they had unconsciously reduced to function had just been redefined in a single sentence, and the man with the document straightened slightly, his expression shifting from confusion to reassessment, while others around him began to understand that they had misread the entire structure of what they were witnessing. And Daniel stepped one pace closer, continuing without hesitation. She identified the inconsistency before submission, validated the data independently, and prevented a systemic error that would have propagated through multiple divisions. And the silence that followed was absolute, not forced, not dramatic, but complete, and Emily finally spoke, not to defend, not to elaborate, but simply to confirm. "It was already visible," she said, and that was all she added, and in that moment, nothing else needed to be said, because the weight of understanding had already shifted fully, and the man with the document lowered it slightly, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement, while the surrounding staff no longer watched her as someone outside their system, but as someone who had quietly been operating within a level they had not been trained to recognize. And Daniel returned to his original position slowly, his expression unchanged, but his conclusion final, because silence, when combined with clarity, did not remain silence for long, it became recognition. And Emily Carter did not smile, did not react, she simply continued forward as if nothing had changed at all, though everything already had.